Good afternoon and welcome to the first event in our Beyond the Rails programme, celebrating 200 years of the modern railway. My name is Ruby Sarang and I'm a member of the Rail Advisory team here at Steer. I'm very grateful that you've tuned in to listen to this conversation about driving customer centricity in an increasingly complex rail sector. I'm even more grateful to be joined by Alex Robertson, CEO of Transport Focus. Alex joined Transport Focus in November 2023. He spent over 5 years at the Transport for London early in his career, working in policy and public affairs. After a brief spell in the voluntary sector, he moved to the Electoral Commission, where he was Director of Communications and the Programme Director for the Scottish Referendum and EU Referendum. Prior to joining Transport Focus, Alex was the Executive Director for Strategy and Operations with the Parliamentary Health Service Ombudsman, and then Chief Operating Officer at the Pension Ombudsman. Alex, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
From my perspective, putting the customer at the heart of the railway is no longer optional, it's essential. We're changing priorities and patterns, ensuring customer satisfaction, and perhaps more importantly, loyalty is key to a thriving and attractive rail service across Great Britain. There are plenty of lessons to be learned from across Europe and beyond that strengthen the argument that keeping the customer happy is good for business. With an ever-changing landscape, politically, economically and socially, operators must keep up with customer needs and the many increasing pressures from across the industry. With operators competing with each other and other modes, they must do more to stand out from the crowd. And bringing us right up to the present day, the government have just published its consultation document, a key part of their proposed reform, and in the Williams Rail Review which preceded it. It's based on resetting the relationship with the customer and the rail passenger in particular, re-establishing trust following a period of disruptive journeys and building confidence, despite the complexity of the fare system and ticket retailing and enforcement. So that's the landscape, and I'm looking forward to chatting to Alex about as much of it as we can today. Alex, perhaps a good place to start would be to provide some context. How has the reliability and convenience of rail services changed over the past 15 years? And what are the key issues passengers face today?
Thanks. A really good question. I think it's worth, you can get very caught up in the day-to-day, can't you? And so, I mean, what passengers want today is more or less the same thing as they wanted 10 or 15 years ago. It's sort of easy to imagine that because technology has changed our lives in so many ways, we would want something different from railway. We don't really. We want, and we ask passengers periodically what their top priorities are: value for money, reliability, accessible, being able to get a seat. Those things, you get little variations every so often you ask it, but those things are still there. And it's really important that we don't get, I think, distracted by the kind of nice, shiny new stuff and miss getting the basics right. If you then think about those things and what has happened in the last 10 or 15 years, and again, it's important to zoom out. You sort of get sucked in what's going on with strikes or disruption during the autumn or whatever it is. Cancellations now are about twice the level they were 15 years ago. So a cancellation now, you'd have 1 in 20, 1 in 25 trains, about 4 or 5%. 15 years ago, it would be 2%, 1 in 50. It's really quite a big difference. It's a doubling. And obviously a corresponding but not quite so stark reduction in reliability. I think we all know that. And my conversations with people since I've started across the rail industry is that people do get the importance of sorting that out. I don't think there's any doubt about that. The challenge is how, and as we go through the reforms that you're mentioning, how we keep the customer and their priorities in the front of our mind, and how does that drive decision making?
So you mentioned that you don't think passenger needs have fundamentally changed actually in the last 15 years, but certainly the issues and challenges in the railway have. Is there anything that you've learned from your time at Transport for London at the start of your career that's relevant now?
Yeah, definitely. Gosh, it's such a long time ago. And so we were saying a little bit before we kind of joined on air that some things are the same, some things are sort of different. So it's funny how much what's happened with the passage of time. So Transport for London was created in 2000, and it brought together, so this is going to be similar, isn't it? We're creating Great British Railways. It brought together lots of different organisations, the Underground, buses, roads in London. So a huge organisation was created out of what were actually quite relatively publicly invisible bits of the civil service and other institutions in London. And they were made accountable through the Transport Commissioner, the Transport Commissioner for London, appointed by the mayor. And you got two things, and absolutely not immediately. You got more integration in decision making. If you ever listened to, and many of you listening will have heard Lord Hendy speak about this. He was at Transport for London the whole time that I was there. That everyone who needed to make a decision to sort out a problem was in the room. You couldn't look at outside the room and say, "Oh, that's not us. It's another company. It's another organisation." And the other thing, so my job back then was in public affairs and policy. And actually, my very first job was managing Transport for London's relationship with the London Assembly. And I've got to say, I found that quite hard. And they asked us lots of things that, I wouldn't have said this particularly at the time for obvious reasons, we found quite irritating, quite hard to manage. More information. I was taking, actually, Peter Hendy, I would take him to a Transport Committee meeting every month probably, and other managing directors and commissioners would go along. You'd have mayor's question time every month, have 2 hours with transport. Anyway, my point there is the accountability. So you had the integration and you had the accountability, and those were, I think if you'd had the integration without the accountability, it would have been difficult to know that you were to really keep that customer focus. And forever there, and I'm sure there are things that people working there at the time would say they should do differently, and people who experienced the service from the outside would say it should have been done differently. But I do think we developed over time a customer-focused culture, and part of that was the kind of outside scrutiny and challenge to really make sure that we were doing the right thing, the thing that customers were most bothered about.
So you mentioned how the aim of Transport for London was to bring together some of these organisations that necessarily didn't have accountability previously. As we move through rail reform, how do we think we can design a system that prioritises passenger needs rather than just structural or operational changes within the industry?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think part of it is starting by being quite honest about how challenging that will be. It will be quite challenging creating an organisation which, if I've got it right, I think will have 100,000 employees, GBR. And it would be quite easy to end up focusing on transactional, organisational creating behaviours and lose sight of the opportunities to do things better for customers. So some of that will be getting customer priorities and literally getting customers in the room to share problems and challenges. Some of it will be making sure that you don't replicate some of the divisions that you've got between different organisations now in one organisation. Obviously, it's worth saying it isn't like there will only be one organisation running the railway. Of course, there will be open access and freight, and you guys, everyone listening, will know that. Of course, I'm simplifying it somewhat, but that we don't create a new series of boundaries that are contained within GBR. I think that will be important. I think there's something about the signal that we send out very early on about how important customers are, that it isn't just business as usual. We will very quickly, won't we, talk operationally. And I was saying earlier, and it's of course true and right, that the railway should be focused on reliability and cancellations. But if we just talk in that language all the time, where's the customer in that? And might there be an opportunity, for example, to talk about our primary objective is to improve customer experience and set a metric or a standard or something really pretty symbolic that says actually now it's really about customers, and we're going to use that to drive all of our decision making, all of our thinking, and yeah, I mean, let's not understate the scale of the challenge, but also the opportunity that's created by it.
Absolutely. Is there anything in the rail reform proposals that you particularly like or think is missing?
Oh, that's a good question. So we are looking through it in some detail, and we've said a relatively limited amount 10 days ago when it was published, and it's worth doing it properly. No, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for it. When we asked, I mean, yeah. So I've only been back in transport for 15 months. If anyone who's worked in transport for the last 7 or 8 years will have had talk of rail reform for that whole period. But of course, it's now going to happen. And one of the things that we did, this is obviously before my time, is ask the public what they thought about rail reform. Now, most people, and this is funny, isn't it? When you get into any kind of element of public service delivery, you can overestimate the extent to which the public are interested in your organisation or reforms. They just want a good service. And of course, that is completely true of the public. They just want a good service. But when you start to have a conversation with them about it, they will recognise the fragmentation of it. They'll experience it in different ways. They won't use the same language that people in the industry necessarily would, but they want someone to take responsibility when things go wrong. So there was an opportunity in bringing the track and trade together and to putting a single institution in charge of it. But then you've really got to be super careful. You don't create this sort of centralised bureaucracy. You've got to push the decision making down within it. So I really think there was a tremendous opportunity through bringing those together. I mean, what would be a good example? I mean, the passenger assist. So if you're a disabled passenger and you book passenger assistance and it isn't fulfilled in the way that it should be, and actually that happens a lot more than it should do, you don't care if it's Network Rail, one TOC or another TOC that's responsible for it. Of course you don't. Does anyone really think that? But through creating a single organisation where you bring all that together, I think you've got a better chance of getting a culture which it doesn't matter if it's a failed passenger assist. It's a failed passenger assistant that counts against all of us. So I think there will be something there, but I don't think we'll get the benefits from that change unless we get the culture change right at the same time.
Absolutely. So you spoke about how Transport Focus previously asked customers and engaged their thoughts on rail reform. What do you think are the biggest challenges in ensuring that customer engagement is meaningful rather than performative? And how do you think we as an industry can avoid just focusing internally when we're shaping GBR?
Yeah. So it's funny because you get a bit self-reflective when you say things like this, and you wonder what role am I playing? What was my organisation playing it? So it's the performative versus what's the opposite of performative? Something that really delivers something, I suppose. It is tempting to get into a series of conversations where you tick a box and you say you've talked to people who represent passengers, or you've consulted groups that represent disabled people, disabled passengers, and you sort of do that at the beginning and end of things, or you test something out with them, but you're not really doing it. You're not really engaging with the issue. Mm-hmm. There's sort of something about how you open up your processes and you put the problem on the table, and you also get out on the network. You get out and you find out what it's really like. I mentioned the passenger assist. I spent yesterday in the West Midlands with a disabled passenger going around and experiencing passenger assist, and it's a massive eye opener for me. I mean, I've spent 50 months saying how important I think it is, but just realizing practically how the stuff you're writing down and saying, the stuff you're performing or filling forms in, actually relates to the real experience of doing that. If you, for example, got a help point in a station, so I don't know how many folk listening to this would have done this. Go and press it. So I'm not suggesting now 170 people haven't been listening. Go off and do this while I'll get in trouble. But have we really tested out the systems that we are saying work or are there for people? You can have a help point that works because it is literally functionally working, and the signal goes back and forth to whoever's picking up the phone. But does it give you any information that you need in the way that you need it? Can the person on the phone hear you when you're speaking and it's noisy behind you? Is the person on the end of the phone someone who knows anything about the route that you're on, and they can give you some plausible, useful advice? Well, all the answers to all those questions yesterday were no, but it would have probably, the passenger help point I was talking about, would probably have ticked the box as working. So there's something, and back to my Transport for London experience. So I've been sharing this with a few people recently. I remember, I don't know if anyone remember this. So a guy called Tim O'Toole coming around the London Underground from 2004 to I can't remember when. And I was doing some of the public affairs, so some of the kind of stakeholder meetings for him. Mm-hmm. And I knew how busy we'd be from a corporate stakeholder engagement point of view. And I was very surprised when he said to me, I'm going to, I wasn't that senior, I wasn't really involved in the conversations, but I sort of heard him say, I'm going to go out on the Underground for one day every week. And I was like, what are you talking about? That, I mean, obviously didn't say that to him. But that's crazy. We'll never have enough time. How can that possibly be the right thing to do? He kept himself incredibly grounded in what was going on in stations, and he knew station staff, and he was talking to passengers, and he became an absolute expert on the detail of how you ran the different lines and the problem in the Northern Line, the problem in the Piccadilly line. So there's something about, so that was not a performative thing. I mean, he probably got some credit for being able to say that publicly, but that wasn't sitting in a forum with a bunch of passengers sort of nodding along and answering their questions. He was out there getting his hands dirty, trying to work out what it was really like. And actually, very, very importantly, trying to work out what the challenges were for his colleagues who he was saying to, you need to run a more reliable service. Why is the Northern Line not working the way it should do? Well, he might find out something that if he'd sat there and read a piece of paper and talked to the managers, would have been massively diluted and not that helpful in terms of actually solving the problem.
Absolutely. And you've spoken about meaningful customer engagement throughout the process rather than just at the beginning, at the end. And for me, one of the most important things about making customer engagement meaningful is making sure you're engaging with a diverse group of customers that represent the communities and the user base that you're trying to support. And you talk about passenger assist and accessibility in particular. Unfortunately, we always hear poor stories about accessibility on the railway, just because you don't tend to hear the good stories, because people don't tend to shout when they've got good service, but they will complain if they don't have what they need. What do you think are some of the concrete examples of how we can design and procure rail services in a way that truly improves accessibility and overall passenger experience?
So I think, it's one of those things where actually asking the question and recognising the scale of the opportunity is perhaps the most important thing. But obviously to help with that, a couple of thoughts. So one is from my own experience, and one is probably slightly more of a general principle. So we did some, obviously before my time, we worked with Merseyrail when they procured their new fleet of trains. So some time ago now, and some of you on the call may have some knowledge of this. But there is a sort of a temptation perhaps sometimes to get input from people with a diverse range of needs, disabled passengers, others, at the beginning, at the end. Get the spec right and then come back and check at the end that we've met the spec. And as you will all know, or many of you will know, and I will know from other walks of life, that the things that you want at the beginning and that you say, things change, don't they? It's not a completely straight line process. And what we did with Merseyrail was set up a customer community that was there at the beginning and at every stage of the design process, and mock-ups were tested. And crucially, and I don't know the ins and outs of how this was achieved, and I can imagine there would be some challenges in replicating it. But the procurement allowed the spec to change after the point the company that was delivering the new trains was appointed, so that the engagement was real. So they were in a room and they could be asked questions, and if the consensus was, or there were good reasons to not do what was originally in the spec, then it could be changed. So I think that's very interesting, and I'd love to think about how that could be that general model, that general principle of co-creation. Obviously, it's harder with big bits of engineering to do than say with a piece of software, which I've been used to in other walks of life. But so that's one thing, the genuine co-creation and engaging with some of those really hard questions. We're not going to do procurement like we always have. We'll think about we can do it in a way where we have that flexibility built in. The other is, and if you chat to any groups that represent disabled passengers, they'll talk about nothing about us without us. And what does that mean? Well, I suppose it means slightly the example I've just given you, but we've also got to be prepared to take some risks, and we've got to trial some stuff and pilot it and see what works, and recognise that the answers to some of these things are really not straightforward. And again, to use some of the examples from yesterday when I was out on the night, if you want to if you haven't done booked passenger assist in advance, and your train's coming in and you want to catch the attention of the train manager so that you then get the assistance that you're entitled to get on the train. Well, how do you make yourself aware? And actually, do you create a sort of a big, brightly coloured part of the platform that you wait in, and that's where the train crew manager looks to get that apparently has been trialled and didn't work for various reasons. So there is something about being brave enough to get customers in the room and disabled passengers in the room, pilot, and actually you'll find that a lot of people will go with that. And I do think there's something about, if we can get the accountability and the culture right in GBR, they'll be prepared to take some risks and do some stuff that's different. And then, and this is I think quite important, because what you don't then want is you want to keep the innovation and the piloting to work out to get your best chance at getting a good outcome. But then particularly with things around accessibility, you do need some consistency and some predictability. So once you've trialed it and you know it works, you then roll it out. It's the same everywhere. So if you go to platforms, this is what you do, this is where you stand, this is what it looks like, this is what it feels like, this is what you expect. We don't have 17 different accessibility policies. It is this is what you always expect. The person that wears this does it, that's what they do. If you say this, that will happen. So there's something about once you've sort of done that, designed it in the right way, done the piloting, you use the opportunity created by having a more unified network to get the consistency of experience right.
Thank you. You've spoken about accountability quite a lot throughout this conversation. And obviously, there's no real change without accountability. But we need to find a way to measure that accountability. How do you think we can set clear customer-focused metrics, such as prioritising customer satisfaction over operational statistics, for example, to ensure that both short-term and long-term changes benefit passengers?
Yeah. So I think if you took just the question of indicators, I think it would be quite interesting and you would want to do this, you wouldn't just sort of pluck it out there, it would be part of a bigger change that you were describing, to do a proper high volume real customer experience survey like NRPS used to be back in the old days, but you would do it, and you're doing it in a very different environment now, so you're using it probably in a slightly different way. You do it periodically. It gives you some detailed depth and understanding about what's beneath the experience. So you don't just get a number, you get the number and you get the granularity to help you understand what's going on. And you set that as a target for the whole industry. We want to get customer satisfaction from 80, whatever it is, or 70, whatever it is, up to 90, or whatever the target is. Realistic. You've got to buy in. You've got to think there's a plan to get there. Customers do not like being promised things that they like. They like honesty. It's difficult, isn't it? And we're all customers, aren't we? Our expectations aren't always realistic. So, but people want to have something honest said to them. They don't want to have promises made that can't be kept. Alongside, obviously, the desire for sort of rapid improvement. So you'd have maybe a customer satisfaction metric, perhaps, or a net promoter score, or something at the top of the industry that drives the culture and behaviours. You have beneath it some operational measures, because of course you need operational measures to reflect those customer priorities: reliability, cancellations, accessibility, and so on. You have those as well. You publish them. I think this is one of the interesting challenges about the political context in which and the democratic context, I suppose, in which Transport for London was created is very different to the one in which we're creating nationally with GBR. I think that's obvious, but it does mean that some of the things that were naturally happening in terms of accountability in London will not actually necessarily happen straightforwardly for GBR. So when you think about how that's recreated, so there's that very public accountability of these are the targets, these are the measures, this is how often it will get reported, these are how we'll hold these people to account. The equivalent of turning up in the London Assembly every so often, or Evening Standard. It's obviously hasn't got the readership that it used to, but it was very clear how you were held to account for that service in London. Now, and interesting with this, and it's not quite the same thing, but I think it's worth actually me saying this, because I think it's a real danger for people like me who are campaigning or speaking on behalf of passengers, that we become a voice that's just shouting, do it faster, do it now, and we become unrealistic too. There's got to be the space, and this is where there's no substitute for a really good communication to say, do you know what, actually on this stuff we're not going to see much change for a while, and here's why, but here's the plan. Let me tell you the things that we're doing and why we'll get it right. And that's going to be quite hard to do, and I think you will need, and this was the case in London, and let's see what happens nationally. You do need a chief executive or chair or figurehead within GBR who can manage that public space. Otherwise, however well you set up the metrics, the kind of hard accountability, if you like, they won't be able to manage and this is even to 20 years ago, this is quite different, the expectation of day-to-day commentary and what's going on. And you've got to find a way to navigate that, as well as have the kind of structures to deliver over the long term.
Absolutely. We've only got a few minutes left, but is there anything else that you think is really important for ensuring that the customer is at the centre of a very complex rail system? And perhaps is there anything that you've learned from the other sectors that you've worked in that we can perhaps lean on?
So I mean, never underestimate the impact of culture and leadership That is so true, and I think it's easy to get sucked into plans and processes before you've really thought about that. So I do think that's important. One of the things, it's not quite what I've directly learned, but I've read a very interesting book, as anyone who's spent a bit of time with you recently will know, called Failed State by someone called Sam Friedman, who was an advisor in the previous government. And he's not writing it from a partisan perspective, but he talked about in that book about some of the challenges of delivering public services, just generally in the last 15 to 20 years, how the world has changed and the pressures that it puts on people. I used to work at the Electoral Commission, and I mean, literally every word. I mean, because we were responsible for things like referendum, you'd say something, you'd be in the news the afternoon, and so being able to manage that public space, if you see it as a sort of horrible, evil thing that should just go away, it won't go away. You've got to find a way of dealing with it effectively, and actually using, and I think this would be true of Transport for London, losing your public messages about this is what's important to us to also help drive your organisational change within the organisation. I think those things are important. One thing we haven't mentioned is the importance of one of the things we benefited from, and again, you look back and probably realise it more than I did at the time, but having a strategy in London. So we haven't talked about the government's ambitions for an integrated national transport strategy. Very interesting to see where that goes and what that delivers. But in London, where it was very much linked to spatial planning, and there's a London plan, and the transport strategy sort of alongside and slightly underneath it. There was a coherence to what we were doing. You sort of knew what would be expected, and it did drive a lot of stuff at a local level. So they're those sort of tools that you need to make sure you're. I mean, I can't remember who it was. There was something where someone said how fragmented. Maybe it was in the context of how fragmented, and we don't think in a multimodal way, do we? I haven't mentioned that. I should do. The importance of thinking between modes. I've talked exclusively about rail, but how important is it that look at it differently. When you get out of a train station, how often is it not obvious where the buses are, and you can't understand where the bus stop is? It doesn't even feel like it's part of, even just changing the way that the pavements and the immediate layout around the station can make it feel very different. So there's a fragmentation, but why wouldn't there be a fragmentation? The way that we've set up our transport system, the fragmentation of it, you wouldn't expect it. It'd be surprising if it was really integrated. So there are a few things that are happening now, but you've got to get the culture right. You've got to embrace some of those sort of challenges as you do it to end up in hopefully a much better place. Maybe not immediately, but give yourself a decent shot of getting there in the longer term.
The point about multimodal integration is a really interesting one, isn't it? Because it seems that it's so obvious when you think about it that you'd have information about the next or the nearest buses, for example, at the station, and these probably seem like quick wins, but actually we do know that nothing worth having is easy. But actually, do you think there are some quick wins that we can implement as an industry to try and improve customer service?
I think there probably are. I mean, so there's something about the sort of transparency of information about reliability and cancellations, and giving this sense that that you're being open about that and you're being honest about what improvements. We've done a lot of. So this is probably slightly more to the point. We've done some interesting work recently on communications around disruption. We did a really interesting bit where we went out on a bit of the network where we had people in the station, we had people in control centre, and we were looking at the information, what was going up on the platform, what was going up on the main notice board, what was going on in control centre. There was some stuff there that shouldn't be that hard to fix, and actually just getting good information is fourth on people's list of priorities. It's during disruption. It's really quite high up there. So that communication integrated, really good, giving a sense to people you're cared for. So we got you into this, we'll get you out of it. Sense, rather than we can publish this because that's the thing we've been told to publish, or it's not our responsibility to think about the next stage of the journey. So I do think there's something there. Again, even then it's short term, but as you were saying a moment ago, these things aren't that easy to do, and I certainly don't want talking to a bunch of folk, many people, in many cases, who are trying to do it, to suggest that it is easy. But those would be some of the more immediate wins, I think, would be around the communication of information to passengers.
There's certainly lots to do. It's certainly not going to be easy, but there's plenty to think about there. I can see we're about out of time. A big thank you to you, Alex, for sharing your insight today, and thank you also for the audience for joining us. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is our first event in our Beyond the Rails programme. The next will be a panel discussion on innovation in rail on the 1st of April with speakers from Network Rail, Freightliner and Worldline. You'll find the link to the register to that in the follow-up email that you're going to receive later today. With that, it's a goodbye from Alex and I. Thank you.
Thanks, Libby. Thanks, everyone.